President Obama said he'd make a decision soon on how many more troops he'll send. Well, here to discuss the issue of the surge in numbers is Colonel Richard Kemp, a former commander of British forces in Afghanistan. There he is. And Malou Innocent, a foreign policy analyst at the Cato Institute, who joins us from Washington. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, both of you. If I could start with you, Richard Kemp, just give the case for a surge. Briefly, explain why more troops will work in this situation.
Well, I think there are two principal aspects to this. And the first one is that it's fundamental to our strategy to build up the Afghan National Security Forces to the level where they can take on the insurgency themselves. And the majority of troops in a significant American surge, I think, would be involved in accelerating and deepening the training of the Afghan National Army. It's a big job. It's not going to happen overnight, but we do need more troops to do it. And secondly, we need more troops to occupy population centres to protect the Afghan people in those centres from attack by the Taliban, to get to know the people in those population centres, which can only be done by long-term presence and building up a relationship, gaining the trust. And in that way also, not just gaining the trust and protecting the people, but gaining intelligence from them about the activities of the Taliban around that area. And that has proved to be very successful in prosecuting the campaign against the Taliban.
Okay. Malou Innocent, if I could ask you, that seems to make a lot of sense, doesn't it?
It does and it doesn't. I can understand why we would want to train the Afghan National Security Forces and the Afghan National Police, but what are we training them for and who are we training them to protect? We're training them to be an apparatus of the Afghan state, the centrally administered government under Hamid Karzai. Not only did the first round elections were ridden with fraud, but we must also consider the pervasive corruption that is endemic within Karzai's regime and the warlords that he backs as his power base. And so if we look at the widespread corruption within the Afghan government and the fact that these officers and these police forces would be essentially an arm of that government, we have to really consider and be careful that we're not essentially propping up what many Afghans perceive to be an illegitimate government in Kabul.
Indeed. Richard Kemp, we know what Carl Eikenberry, the US ambassador, said this week. If you don't deal with corruption, there is no point sending any more troops. And Malou's just made that point again. That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
I agree, it's absolutely fundamental. She's absolutely right. We must deal with that issue. And I think it's one of the major causes of complaint and dissatisfaction among the people in Afghanistan is the corruption of their government. They will not support, they will not be able to support, those that do continue to support a government that is quite blatantly corrupt. They do recognise that the greatest enemy they have, and 90%, in a recent poll, 90% of people considered that the Taliban was the greatest threat to Afghanistan, but they must be able to support their government, and the Afghan National Security Forces must also be able to support their government. We should not have let the situation develop in the way it has. We should not have had such corruption in the elections, which was probably the biggest setback this campaign has had this year, certainly, and possibly in all the years it's been running. And now it's up to the Americans, it's up to the British, up to other NATO and international statesmen and leaders to do their best to get Karzai to clean up his regime. And we should be looking at probably other measures as well. We should be looking perhaps at having a lawyer jirga to give some legitimacy to a government, but that would depend upon it being cleaned up first. We should also look at maybe reforming the system of government, pressurising the Afghans to do so. And I'm using these words advisedly because we can't really sort of exercise too heavy a hand, but we have to influence. If we're going to invest our lives, our soldiers' lives, and our resources in Afghanistan to the level we are, we must attempt to do something about it. And I think to develop a government, perhaps less presidential, more parliamentary in style, which has a broader base and which the whole of the population, or certainly a wide spectrum of the population, can feel that they can support. I think something along those lines is necessary, but I don't pretend for a moment we're going to have a Western-style democracy in Afghanistan.
Sure. I mean, Malou Innocent, I mean, it's clear, isn't it, that the only way that NATO forces are going to be able to pull out of Afghanistan is if the Afghan security forces are built up. The problem at the moment is that there aren't enough NATO troops to do that. Surely a surge is needed.
Well, I think we've sort of strayed away from the original objectives of the mission. When we remember back in 2001, the reason why we went into Afghanistan was to go after Osama bin Laden and the al-Qaeda network and the Taliban regime that harbored them. But since then, we've seen a gradual broadening of the mission. Now we're being told that Western troops must now protect the villages of Afghanistan from the Taliban. We're being told that we must eradicate corruption endemic to the Afghan government. And we've definitely been sort of drifting away from the original objectives, and also it doesn't appear to appear to be the case that creating a centrally administered government in Afghanistan is critical to keeping the West safe. We must consider the fact that Al-Qaeda is a global network. It's a decentralized network. They have cells in Yemen and Somalia and Pakistan, and it's unclear to me, at least, that creating any sort of government in Kabul, whether it's parliamentarian or whether it's a democracy, will be necessary to keeping the West safe. And honestly, we can give General McChrystal everything he wants. We can give him 40,000 troops, 80,000 troops, and the jihadist threat will not melt away.
I mean, Richard Kemp, there is a sense of drift, isn't there? The West is certainly, as far as deciding how many troops should go in, dithering in the minds of some people. There are some suggesting that perhaps this war is lost. The best thing to do now is to get out.
We can't possibly get out because for very many reasons, one of which is, are we really prepared, are we really genuinely prepared in Britain or in the United States of America to contemplate defeat in this campaign, with all the implications that would have on encouraging what we've just heard is a global international jihadist movement led by Al-Qaeda, inspired by Al-Qaeda. Are we prepared to inspire those by our defeat in this country? We don't need to be defeated. What we need to do, we need to increase our troop numbers. We need to support the Afghan National Security Forces, build them up so they can take over responsibility. We mustn't forget also, absolutely crucially, and this point is not often made but is central, we must not allow a vacuum to develop in Afghanistan, which can be exploited by the extremists. And Taliban, Al-Qaeda, they're all of a cloth, exploited by the extremists to enable attacks into Pakistan by their own insurgency movement, which is causing increasing damage, increasing deaths and casualties against the government. The end of that would be a Pakistan in the hands of Islamist extremists, and we cannot have a nuclear armed state in that situation.
Malou Innocent, is that what you're suggesting, that perhaps all NATO troops should get out as fast as possible?
I think there should be a gradual phased withdrawal from Afghanistan according to certain benchmarks, according to certain metrics that similar to what we had in Iraq. But I think the notion that we must look at what Al-Qaeda wants and essentially, sort of shape the narrative in that sense, we must also consider in that respect that we also look weak by remaining in Afghanistan. The military does appear bogged down, the strategy and the mission does appear aimless, and the longer we're there, the longer the Western troops are there, the more they're perceived to be an occupying presence. And this is sort of the double-edged sword of sort of nation building and wars of occupation, is that when do you dance the sort of fine line between being a defender of Afghan rights and being an occupier of those Afghan rights and an offender of those Afghan rights. And I think we also must consider the broader regional dynamic as well. There's a great deal of infiltration of the cross-border sanctuaries within Pakistan, and of course we know that the Pakistanis have a decreased incentive to stop allowing militants to pour over the border because of increased Indian influence in Afghanistan. So once again, I mean, the notion that we can just send troops and that'll ameliorate some of the regional problems and the contextual problems indigenous within Afghanistan sort of misses this broader point, and the fact that we also fulfill Al-Qaeda's narrative in some sense. We sort of give Al-Qaeda exactly what they want, which is the Western military bogged down in a bloody and protracted guerrilla war that increases the recruitment to their cause. So if we're going to look at Al-Qaeda's narrative and that it'll be a boost to global jihad if we withdraw, we also need to look at whether or not we're boosting global jihad the longer we prolong the mission.
Right. Okay, we'll leave it there. Malou Innocent in Washington and Colonel Richard Kemp here in London. Thanks very much.